This week, we're talking about strategy, where it came from, how it developed, and where it's going next. Hi, I'm Blaine Worthington, Executive Director of the La Jolla Center for Pacific Strategy. When I say the word strategy, many of you probably think of military strategy. That's a reasonable thing to think about because for most of human history, strategy has been uh, the realm of strategists in the military. Generals, we think of people like Napoleon and these strategic geniuses that have existed throughout history, who have made the right call at the right time, had some vision for how to achieve it, and were able to coordinate these large forces to achieve them. It's reasonable that strategy would develop as a military art. Throughout human history, there is no activity that humans undertake that is more existential than combat. And so it pays to think deeply about when and how and if one should deploy it. And if you are going to deploy it, you should have a clear idea of why and be able to communicate those objectives to the people you're asking to sacrifice, potentially their lives. The timelessness of that subject is, I think, highlighted by the texts that we still have on the bookshelves under strategy today. And both the East and the West have their kind of ancient strategist that has survived the intervening millennia and still informs particularly military thinking today. In the West, you had the Athenian general and historian Thucydides. In the East, you had Sun Tzu. If you walk into a Barnes and Noble today, you will be able to find their words on the shelves. For the next, several thousand years, or a couple of thousand years, they have kind of been the template. And really not until you get into the 1700s, 1800s, do we really get an update of military strategy by imposing a political framework beyond just the military, the achievement of military objectives. And that comes with a gentleman named Clausewitz, who was a Prussian officer. And Clausewitz developed this idea of a trinity that linked the military aspect of strategy to the governmental objectives, the political objectives of strategy, and to the morale and the kind of buy-in of the body politic of the people. Those were the three things that were required to succeed in military operations, because what Clausewitz identified was that war was an extension of policy. One went to war to achieve political aims. And once he kind of made that connection, strategy branched out almost explicitly from just the military world to the political. You see that expansion grow over the next 200 years. Later in the 1800s, you have Alfred Thayer Mahan start writing about naval strategy and naval power and sea power. And Mahan ties sea power to economic objectives, and that maritime trading nations can become quite wealthy, and that wealth is a source of national power, and that source of national power should be defended by a global navy that protects one's trading interests. From there, strategy now includes an economic component. So we've tied it from the military to the economic to the political component through these strategists. When we get into the 20th century, strategy starts developing even further. And in the early kind of first half of the 20th century, we start talking about geostrategy, things of being geostrategic. And that comes from a pair of strategists called Mackinder and Spikeman, who started looking at terrain in the way that maybe a battlefield commander might identify terrain. Sun Tzu talked about terrain 2,500 years ago. In the context of combat, they looked at terrain from a global perspective. They looked at geography and identified how the nature of geography on the globe has defined the kind of strategic objectives and strategic cultures of various peoples throughout the world. So they've expanded the realm of strategy a bit further. That's kind of takes us to the nuclear age. The nuclear age changed the nature of strategic thought completely. Because of if war itself was an existential threat, nuclear annihilation took that to a kind of species existential problem. So you had what had been defined through these strategic philosophies over the past 2,500 years started transitioning out of the world of philosophy, of intuition, of genius, and transitioned into the world of science. And you started seeing things like game theory being applied to strategic questions. You started seeing frameworks being applied to make strategy a kind of repeatable and defined process that could be taught and could be sort of mass produced in some ways by teaching these strategic frameworks. And a lot of this work came out of Rand and their field of systems analysis. System analysis caught on during the 60s in the Kennedy administration under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who was a big believer in systems analysis coming from his time with Ford. Fast forward to the end of the 20th century, and you start seeing these formal planning frameworks proliferating through specifically the Pentagon. And in the strategic sense, you have the development of the ends, ways, and means model, which is specifically that one develops strategic ends, objectives that are nested within a desired end state, right? What does the world look like that you want to create? What are the objectives that you must achieve that would be a condition of that end state? And then you look at your ways and means, the methods you have available and the resources you have available, and apply them to achieving those specific strategic objectives that if they were all to be achieved, your desired end state would be the way the world is. That framework was combined with a framework that examined the instruments of national power. And those instruments of power started with the DIME model, D-I-M-E, that define the instruments of national power as diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. So you see in those instruments of power, in some ways, you can tie them back to Clausewitz's Trinity, and you can tie them to Mahan's discussion of economics. Those become the instruments of power. That model has been updated since additional instruments have been identified, but that gives you a sense of the framework. And if you combine the ends, ways, means models with some model of instruments of power, you develop a very repeatable process that can be taught to the thousands of military officers that need to learn them. You combine this framework idea with the development of a concept of joint planning and the interagency, in which the military is not leading strategy um, only in the military domain, but in which the entire uh, all elements of the state can be directed toward the achievement of international strategic aims. And at this point, strategy is no longer just a um, military goal or a military process, but it becomes a state process. Uh, a it becomes grand strategy, is what we would call it today. So that is a very quick and broad overview of where strategy is today. It is a top down method of coordinating and mobilizing power to achieve long term strategic goals on behalf of the state, on behalf of society. Generally speaking, these strategic problems are problems that require a long term view. They are problems that span states, they're interstate, international problems, transnational problems. And they're problems that require some sort of coordination or competition with other states. These issues that kind of match these criteria are described, can be put on basically three tiers. You have kind of the existential tiers of just like war and peace. And then you have a second tier of issues, which would be economic. These are the very, very, very important issues that the state simply must not fail at. If you are a democracy, if you fail at those things, you will be voted out, or you won't have a country anymore. If you are an authoritarian government, the pitchforks may come out for you if you fail at the economy or security. But then there is this third tier of issues that, because states are pretty much handling the first two tiers, the third tier are the issues that actually impact people's lives most significantly because they get the least state attention. But these issues, things like international crime, climate change, pandemics, supply chain resilience, managing the rise of new technologies like AI. These are the issues that concern most people, because somebody has to be paying attention to them. The state is understandably preoccupied with security and economics, and the gap has been traditionally filled by non-governmental organizations. They have succeeded to date in deploying and mobilizing what you could think of as the inherent strategic capacity of society through voluntary service and philanthropy. And they do that in the service of achieving strategic ends. They are working on transnational issues like the ones we just talked about. And they are doing their best to coordinate amongst themselves and amongst governments and international organizations. But to date, there has not been a planning framework that allows for bottom up strategic planning. That is what social strategy, as we have defined it here at the La Jolla Center, is designed to provide. And in the next few weeks, we're going to talk about specifically what that framework is and how it works. But that is the goal. We would like to provide a rigorous, repeatable, teachable process for developing strategies that employ the instruments of social strategic power, the instruments of strategic power and strategic capacity that exist within society itself. How can coalitions of willing partners connect and mobilize their collective power to achieve these strategic ends. That's what we want to achieve. So, like I said, we'll be talking about that more in the coming weeks. I invite you to continue the conversation with us as we go on by subscribing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel here. In the description, you'll find links to our Substack and our LinkedIn. Subscribe there as well and connect with us on LinkedIn and join the conversation. This is a process we have developed that we want feedback from. We want your engagement with. And so as we roll these ideas out, we would love for you to comment, to send us a message, send us an email, and let us know what you think. So we look forward to talking about this more with you. We look forward to your feedback, and thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon.